talking about surrogacy here today, and surrogacy is it's a really broad term, and it can encompass a whole different range of arrangement types and experiences depending on what country you're in. We're obviously focusing on a domestic context here today in Australia. And so for those that aren't maybe too familiar, surrogacy is legal all around Australia and has been for quite a while now. So arrangements perfectly legal. The only thing that we don't really allow in Australia is we don't allow the surrogate to be compensated any financialness, really bad English, but above reimbursement of expenses, just so that we're all on a base level here. And so today is going to be really great, I think. So I'm joined by two amazing people. We've got Clarke and also Sarah Jefford. So I'll just do a quick introduction for them, and then we'll launch into more of the formal Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So for Alice, so in 1988, Alice Clarke's birth made her Australia's first IVF surrogate kid. And Alice is an award-winning freelance journalist and presenter. So that's really, really exciting that we get her here today. And then we've also got Sarah Jefford. So Sarah Jefford is an IVF mum and later became an egg donor and a surrogate, delivering a baby for two dads in 2018. Sarah is also a surrogacy and donor conception lawyer practicing across Australia from a home in Melbourne. And Sarah was very impressively awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia in 2023 for her work with the surrogacy community and services. Congratulations. I don't think I've said that to you yet, so well done. So we'll start off with some questions first for Alice, and then we'll go over to Sarah, and then we'll bring them both together to answer some group questions. So for Alice, to kick us off, can you please tell me about your family and about how you were conceived?
So my family is a bit of an odd one, I think is the simplest way to put it. Both of my parents were infertile when they met, which is actually a great relief to my dad, because he was very worried to tell mum that he had no sperm. And mum's response, dad was like, I've never told anyone this, and mum's response was wacky do, which is possibly inappropriate given the emotional circumstances, but she had had a hysterectomy in her early 30s. So with both of them infertile, they decided to have a kid, as you do. My aunt Linda gave birth to me, and there was donor sperm using a known donor. And then 8 months later, the only time for early to anything, I showed up.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. And this was also the first gestational surrogacy arrangement in Australia as well. Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Yes, so first in Australia, second in the world. I think there was someone in, I want to say South Africa, who beat us by a couple of months. I think the details are now very foggy. But yeah, it was first gestational surrogacy or IVF surrogate arrangement, and definitely first sister to sister, which was cool.
That's very, very cool. And so this was happened in 1988. What were the laws around surrogacy there at the time?
No one had really thought of surrogacy as an option when they were coming up with the laws, so they just didn't mention it. So there was a nice loophole that we were able to go through, because again, no one had mentioned it. Laws always take a long time to catch up with the real world. After I was born, it was then made explicitly illegal in Victoria until I think I was 19, maybe 20. Presumably because I was too good and they didn't want anyone else after me. But that was surprising. There was a lot of controversy surrounding my birth, which was strange because everybody in my family, nobody had any problems. My Aunt Linda was fine. I'm fine. My parents were fine. And the controversy seemed to come from a lot of people who couldn't understand how something like this could work from their own experiences. And because their frames of reference were so limited and they didn't talk to us, they decided that it was probably bad.
And can you tell me a little bit more about so when did your parents first tell you that you were conceived through surrogacy, and what was your initial reaction?
So mum told me from the time I was a tiny little baby who could not make memories, to have a baby you needed seeds and a nest, and mum and dad didn't have seeds or a nest, so a nice man gave them seeds and Linda gave them a nest. And by the time I could understand, I had always known and didn't care. It also helps that I was presented to the world Lion King style when I was about a month old at a press conference. So I didn't really have any options of not knowing. It was just always a part of everything. And I think that was so important. Because if the parent, like everybody I know who has been upset about being donor conceived or adopted were upset because it was kept a secret, because their parents seemed to be ashamed of it, and that shame then passes over the child. But if you're proud of it and you think it's cool and fine and normal, the kid will generally agree. And so I never had any issues. My reaction was, this is boring. Can we go back and watch some more Daria on TV or whatever it was, Captain Planet? And that was about it.
And as well, just for any academics in the audience, that is typically what we also see as well with all the research that has been done. Limited evidence, but that's the kind of the vibe. It's just like, oh, it's not really that interesting to me, actually. Let's move on.
Yeah.
And now as an adult, though, how has surrogacy impacted your life as an adult, if it has at all?
As a journalist, I end up writing about it every now and then in opinion columns, just because there will be some controversy that gets kicked up of, think of the children, and then I can go, well, as a children, this is how it works. But most of the time, I just kind of forget it. It seems normal. I can make some great jokes about how two of my parents are siblings, and that always goes down well at dinner parties. But I haven't really tried existing the other way, so who knows? But yeah, it does not really affect me at all.
Mm-hmm. You just referred then to like Linda as your parent. Obviously part of the joke there. What do you call, like, what kind of, is Linda just your aunt? Do you call her anything else particularly to surrogacy, or is it just aunt?
No, she's just my Aunt Linda, unless I need to call her something else to make a joke work. Whatever's funniest, really. But when I was little, I kind of had two different designations of not parent, but significant person in creation. So I only have one mum and dad, but I have three mothers and three fathers. So sperm donor's wife, Linda, mum, dad, my uncle Jim, sperm donor. But yeah, generally whatever sells the joke at the time is the term that I'll use. But she's just my aunt, and I think of her the same way as I think of mum and Linda's other Cynthia. If anything, I'm closer to Cynthia. Actually, no, Linda and I now have that Wordle group chat. But really, they're just my aunts. It's not really anything.
I like always love, like, this is just so nice to hear just how much of it, it's just like, it's cool and it's like not really that big of a deal, you know what I mean? And then people in the media all the time are like so dramatic about it. So it's fine.
People always think that things that they haven't experienced are much bigger than they actually are, because in their head they couldn't imagine how that would work for them. And so it's understandable, but when you're in it, it really is just whatever.
And what do you feel has been the best part of being born?
Well, I exist. That's really kind of the main thing. I would not be alive otherwise. But yeah, that's about it. You don't really, like, there's no, like, I was the indulged only child of older parents who didn't think they could have children, and that was great. But yeah, I'm alive. There's nothing really you get from surrogacy. You don't get a certificate or kind of war bonds or something. You just exist.
Wonderful. And I'm interested to know, for someone that is contemplating having a child through surrogacy, what kind of advice would you give them regarding disclosure and raising their future child?
If someone was considering having a child through surrogacy, actually, I have given advice like this because I'm not even the only surrogate child in my family. My cousins recently had 2 kids through surrogacy. It's just really tell them early, tell them often. Make sure they know that you are completely fine and comfortable with the situation and that you love them. But and also beforehand, make sure you are okay with not being the gestational mother of your kid if there is a woman in your relationship, because one of the interesting things out of my parents' setup or my family setup is my Aunt Linda said that she definitely could not donate an egg, but she'd be happy to give birth to me because that was fine. Giving birth was fun, but genetics were really important to her. Whereas my Aunt Cynthia was like, I'll give you any eggs you want. Genetics don't matter to me, but giving birth is a really important part of the experience for me. So just reflect on whether that matters to you. Mum, of course, was, I just want a kid. I'm not really that fussed either way. But just make sure you have thought on that properly, thought through how you will feel, because there will be a child at the end of this and you need to live with them.
Wise. Thank you very much, Alice. We'll go on to Sarah now, and then we'll come back to both of you. My question up. So Sarah, could you please tell me about when you decided to become a surrogate and what were your motivations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a bit of a almost like a watershed moment that I'd had 2 babies, and our first was an IVF bub and our second was a natural conception, a little bit surprised by it. And I found parenting a toddler and a newborn quite challenging, and was thinking, I don't think I want to have any more kids. We're quite happy with the 2 that we have, but I'd really like to experience pregnancy and birth again. And I had always thought I'd become an egg donor because we'd done IVF for male factor infertility. And I was like, hey, I've got the eggs, I could donate to somebody. And I did that and was like, that was great. But again, feeling almost like a grief that I didn't get to experience pregnancy and birth again. And there was a point where I had some contact with women who had been egg donors and then had also become surrogates. And I was like, that's the answer. That's what I can do. And wouldn't it be amazing to see parents with their very much wanted baby, and I don't have to do the parenting, but I get to experience the pregnancy and the birth, and what a gift it could be for those people that can't carry their own children and long for children of their own. And I remember my partner came home from work and I just kind of pounced on him and said, I'm going to be a surrogate. And he was like, maybe we should talk about that a bit more. But it was very much like, okay, no, I think that's the answer that I've been looking for. I don't want more kids, but I do want pregnancy and I can do this. And there were some challenges. I think initially I was like, I can do this, but not with my own egg. And I can be an egg donor, but not carry the baby with those eggs. And initially that's what I thought. And eventually the little girl that I gave birth to is actually from my egg, but there was a bit of mind gymnastics to go before we actually got to the point where we were conceiving with my egg, and it was fine. But yeah, that was my initial thoughts on how I got to be doing surrogacy.
Well, it's so nice to hear that some people do like pregnancy, because I also feel like, and like birth, you get like a lot of horror stories. So that's also really nice to hear. So you carried forward 2 dads. So can you please tell me about your relationship with them, how you met them, and how they supported you throughout the pregnancy?
Yeah, sure. I found them through a Facebook group, which is probably the weirdest thing. Like, people say that's pretty weird. It's weird. Why would you go on social media and find people to give a baby to? But it is what it is. And, this is the world we live in. About 75% of my clients have a surrogate who is known to them. So it'll be a family member. And I think a third of the total is the sister carrying for their sister. But the other 25% of my cases are actually people that have found each other through social media, usually through a Facebook group dedicated to surrogacy. And so I was in these groups for probably 4 or 5 months, thinking about it, talking about it with my partner, working out if we were going to do this, who would I carry for, the sort of people that we were hoping to connect with. And I found the intended parents through that group, and we met for a coffee initially just to kind of get to know each other. I had already thought about some deal breakers for me. Like, if we're going to have a long-term relationship here, it's not just give you a baby and see you later. My partner in particular was really concerned that we needed to find people that didn't see it as a transaction, that they got the baby and we never saw them again. That what sort of people could I be friends with? So I went in with a bit of a list. Like, if I'm going to do this, you better meet the criteria for the sort of people I want to be friends with. And very initially was able to establish that they met a lot of that criteria. And over the next few months, built that relationship with them. I had some things, for example, wanting to know what their relationships were like with other women in their lives. How did they sort of respect the women in their lives? And a few other sort of political alignment sort of questions, that sort of thing. So we built that friendship over the next few months and eventually officially offered to them. And in terms of how they supported me, look, in some ways they were kind of falling over themselves to support me. Two gay dads that, know that they can't do the carrying, but really want to support me in that, but perhaps fumbling their way through, because tracking my cycle on their phone was perhaps not the way that I wanted to be supported by two men. But also they wanted to be very involved in the process and wanting to be very engaged in the making of their baby, which is understandable. And also learning about how reproduction works and how cycles work and how IVF works for two blokes that have never experienced a menstrual cycle. So there were some challenges. When I was pregnant, they did a lot of cooking, like degustation meals, which was quite funny. We worked out that our love languages for them in particular was acts of service. So they would come around and make us this lovely meal, and all I wanted was a pizza on the couch. So trying to, I guess, fumble our way through the ways that we needed support compared to what they were offering, because they would fall over each other, but actually we just wanted somebody to empty the kitty litter and bring in the laundry, that sort of stuff. But they were very engaged, and when they came to all the appointments with me, they helped out with babysitting the kids and essentially taking direction from me in terms of pregnancy stuff. I know they heard somewhere that you shouldn't have yogurt when you're pregnant because of the risk of listeria, and I was surviving on Greek yogurt when I had nausea. So I know that they had to kind of bite their tongue because that was uncomfortable for them, but also I was like, this is my third pregnancy, I'll do it as I please. And then there were other times, for example, baby was breech, and we had the discussion about whether I would try a vaginal breech birth. And they expressed to me, they actually said to me, we know that you get to make the final decision, and we want you to know that we're really anxious about this. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. I know that I can go in there and determine what happens next in terms of birth options and decisions that are made. But also I want them to have a positive birth experience of seeing their baby arrive. And if that means that they're so stressed because I have made a decision, then I need to be able to live with that. So there was always, I guess, a discussion that went on, particularly in the end part of the pregnancy, around decisions that ultimately I was making, but it was always with them in mind as going to be the parents of this baby and wanting them to experience that in a positive way. Yeah.
Really quite an intimate relationship, and I think for people online that don't know, there's a term that's used a lot, and it's like called surrogating, and that's like the terminology used when you meet a prospective tender parent and you date them to figure out if that is the relationship, if that's the intended parents that you want to pursue. And that just came to my mind then when you were describing your relationship, because it is really the complete opposite of transactional. You're really forming these lifelong relationships. And now, you gave birth in 2018, so it's 5 years on. What's your relationship like now with the baby and with the baby now, 5-year-old, and the parents?
Yeah, and you're right, it was very much like dating. There was a point where I felt like I had 3 husbands, 2 gay men, and my partner and I in some sort of weird polyamorous relationship. But also working out what those boundaries were, because I wasn't actually in an intimate relationship, but we made a baby through home insemination, so there was some weird intimacy there that we had to navigate. It was all, we were kind of blurring boundaries of what you think of a relationship as. These days we're off to dinner with them on Sunday, and I expect it to be the full degustation again. We did have to navigate that, particularly in the first year after she was born, because again they were trying to fall over themselves to thank me for her and showing their absolute devotion and love. And they knew in one respect that it was important that I knew that they were still going to be there, that it wasn't transactional. But also, I think they felt so indebted to me, and there was no cash transaction to say, this is what you mean to us. So they had to find other ways to just gush over what I'd done. And it got to the point where it was uncomfortable. And I was like, really, I just want you to be real. And, they would kind of clean the house before I arrived, and they would make sure that she was dressed in the best outfit when I arrived to, because heaven forbid Sarah might think we're not good parents. And we did actually have some counselling together in that first year just to talk through the fact that I actually wanted to see them with the poo explosion. I wanted to see them with the screaming baby, because I didn't give them a perfect baby. I didn't give them a gift of perfect parenting. I gave them parenting with all its glory. And also I didn't want them to see me as a perfect parent of my own kids. I really have spent more time parenting my kids than worrying about how they're parenting theirs. And we needed to kind of move through that to get to a point where we're comfortable with each other, and I can watch them deal with their tantruming 5-year-old and know that they don't feel that I'm judging them for how they parent her. And I think they've really had a big journey on that as well. So, we see each other probably once or twice a month. We sometimes babysit. She comes over and stays over. We see each other pretty regularly, certainly for like milestones, for birthdays and Christmas and that sort of thing. And we've even had some holidays away together for a weekend, which is lovely. Part of that, I think, has become more and more about her, in that the adults have a relationship here, but spending those weekends away, in some ways I could like take it or leave it, but it's really important, I see, for her to have that relationship with me and with my 2 boys, that they're just part of each other's lives, and they're like cousins. They were around here recently, and when her dad said it's time to leave, she said, I don't want to leave, I want to play with these 2 boys because they're like my brothers. And we all just kind of went, well, they are your brothers, sort of. But it's an ongoing conversation. And interesting what Alice said, this little one has never not known that I carried her. It's always been part of the story, and there's photographs of her in my belly. In fact, she's had lots of questions about why they cut me open to take her out, and she's decided she's not going to carry a baby because she doesn't want to be cut open. So surrogacy might be the option for her one day. But in terms of the genetic story, my boys know that she came from my egg, and they have a bit more of an understanding that they share some genetics, and that's why she looks like me or looks like them. She's still a bit young to understand that, but it's never not going to be part of that story. And she calls me Auntie Sarah, and she knows that I carried her, but it is an ongoing discussion. I called her sweetheart recently, and she said, why do you call me sweetheart? You're not my parent. My parents call me sweetheart. And then going, well, and she said, you're not my mum. And I was like, oh, well, and it is like this kind of deferring to the parents to have that conversation, but I'm part of it. And I would never want to overstep, but also wanting to be very honest with her. So similar to Alice, I don't see myself as her mum, but the genetic connection is such that I am her genetic mother, and that is part of her story. So it will never be denied to her. She'll know that going into the future. And I expect as she does get older, that connection will be more important as she sort of works it out herself about why does she look like me or my boys, or, my extended family, and where's my place in her life. As she gets older, she'll work that out herself.
Okay. I'm going to bring Alice in now. We'll go on to the group questions. I've got so many more we can ask, but I do want to allow time for the audience. If not, we'll come back. But one thing, I'm obviously into surrogacy in terms of like the regulations. That's kind of like my angle. So the next 2 kind of questions kind of fit into that. But there are some people who think that surrogacy should not be legal at all, and kind of reasons that are thrown around that it exploits women and that might be unfair to separate a child who gave birth to them. So Alice, let's start off with you, and then we'll go to Sarah. How would you respond to people like this?
That their experience is not universal, and my experience is not universal, but just because they would think that giving up a child would be torture for them doesn't mean that's true for everyone else. And also it is important that when a surrogate gives birth, that the child isn't ripped away from her. She will normally, in most situations, if she can't give up the child, she can keep that child, and it will suck for everyone. But no one is ripping babies away from women who want them. Most women who go into these arrangements know the deal and do not want another child. They just want to do some intense babysitting and experience the miracle of life. I also, growing up, a lot of people said that the children from these arrangements would be really confused about who their parents were, be confused about who they were, and probably shouldn't exist, which one is a bit of a dick thing to say when we do exist. And 2, we know exactly who our parents are. They're the ones who pick us up from netball and make us our favorite meal and bring us Powerade when we're sick. Like, we know exactly who our parents are, and just because you can't imagine it doesn't mean that it's not real. But that does also seem to be an issue that a lot of people on that side of politics have when it comes to imagining lives that are unlike their own in many different fields. But yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, similar to Alice, and I have had people confront me with those views and say, you know, you've basically there's a trauma that you have caused for her and for yourself, which initially I found very confronting. I really had to look at that and go, what have I done? Like, maybe I have actually created trauma or done the wrong thing here, and it's too late, we've done it. But really kind of breaking that down to what is the issue, and like Alice says, somebody else's experience isn't that of mine, and I work towards two things with my clients, but also my own experience. One is that we always make sure that surrogates and intended parents know that she has full bodily autonomy, so the risk of being exploited is lessened because she can still make the final decision about anything that she does to her body, with her body. And that includes deciding to become a surrogate. I have full autonomy to decide to give birth to a baby and not parent it. Why, you know, who's to tell me I can't do that? I think it also can be really reductive to suggest that just because the baby came from your uterus that you must now parent it. Like, who says that? You know, my partner doesn't have a uterus and he's quite capable of parenting our children. So I think it's that kind of weird idea about womanhood and motherhood that just doesn't align with my experience of it, to be honest. And also there's plenty of women who are mothers and call themselves mothers who didn't carry their own children for all sorts of reasons. I think the other thing is that we always consider the best interest of the child. And I consider that every day, not just in my work, but my relationship with her and her parents and my kids. In terms of, as I said before, my relationship with the dads has changed over the years. And now I think ever increasingly it becomes more important, my relationship with her and her relationship with my kids, that I will always be available to her. It's a little bit like if we talked about surro dating, if the dads and I have a divorce and we stop talking to each other and we don't like each other anymore, my relationship with her will endure. We have to make that happen, just like if we were a divorcing couple, because it's her interests that are more important than ours. And, you know, there has been times that we've griped at each other and needed some space for whatever reason, but our relationship with her continues. And I think the dads have appreciated that over the years more and more, that they make contact and say, Darcy's asking questions. Can she, you know, talk to you about what's happening? Or she was asking questions about the C-section, for example. And my kids will ask questions about that. So it becomes much more about that focus than on the adult's experience of it. Yeah, I guess there's this thing where I didn't like the word surrogate. I preferred the word birth mother or birth parent. And because I felt like surrogate was something that I did, whereas birth mother is something who I am. And I think as she's gotten older, it becomes less about me or focus on me and what I did, and more focus on her and what she needs from me. Yeah.
Thank you both.
I just want to add to something that Sarah said, that's okay. One thing I always find quite odd from these generally conservatives who say that you can't take a child away from a woman who gave birth to them, or a person who gave birth to them, because it's so horrible, is that they're generally also anti-abortion advocates who feel that the solution, instead of having abortions, is to give the child up for adoption. And I really like, just be consistent. It's very frustrating, but I don't think you can take them seriously on this topic.
And I think it then comes down to, like, you just want to control women. Wait, maybe.
That's all it is.
Yeah. So my next question is about compensations. This is something that I'm really interested in. So when we talk about compensation with surrogacy, members of the audience here, so in Australia, that a surrogate can get reimbursed for all the expenses related to the arrangement, and then compensation is basically like additional payment onto that, just to basically say thanks in terms of a monetary sense, in terms of the time, effort, and pain involved with carrying a pregnancy and then giving birth. So in Australia, we completely outlaw it because it raises concerns around exploitation. In other countries, compensations are, we call it commercial, but it's they do get paid. So my question now to you, Alice and Sarah, and I'll go to Alice first. Do you think that surrogates in Australia should be compensated for the time, effort, and pain involved with the arrangement?
So my views on this actually have evolved over the last 10 years. When I was a child, I was really against the idea of women being paid because I didn't want to feel like I had been a commodity that had been bought and sold. And I thought that that's how kids would feel, and that was bad. And I think a lot of that actually, funnily enough, came from the Conservatives who were debating against my very existence. But it was the baby Gammy case many years ago. This is a tragic case in Thailand that actually made me properly think about where that view came from. And I realized, and also going through IVF myself, I realized that these clinics are for-profit clinics. They make a lot of money off you. It is no longer about healthcare, and it is purely about creating value for shareholders. Why is it that every single person involved in this process gets either a lot of money or a child, except for the one person who is putting their life on the line and could potentially die for it? If Melbourne IVF can make just a ridiculous amount of money off your hope and desperation, why shouldn't a woman who is going to give up probably really a year and longer term health things, why shouldn't she get something out of it as well, other than just the eternal gratitude of some very nice people?
Mm-hmm. I think similarly, my views have also evolved. If you'd asked me after she was born, I would have said I would never have done it for money, and I don't want money, and introducing money to it commodifies me or commodifies her. And I work with a lot of clients that go overseas and do commercial surrogacy in other countries. So a couple of things I would say is that commercial surrogacy isn't all equal. You can do an arrangement in the US that is very different from an arrangement in Mexico or Ukraine, as you can imagine, for all sorts of ethical reasons. I've also, I guess, politically kind of expanded my view on this. And as Alice said, of all the people making money out of a surrogacy arrangement, including me as a surrogacy lawyer or a counsellor or an IVF doctor, the person putting their lives on the line on the line in terms of just the 12 months plus that they spend doing it, but also their actual lives on the line. We have lots of conversations about life insurance in surrogacy arrangements, and all the physical risks that they take. They don't get paid, and they're sometimes lucky to break even. In fact, they're really lucky to break even because we can't compensate them for things like lack of sleep and nausea and illness. And I've had clients who have been so unwell during pregnancy, and the only thing the intended parents can do is help them around the house and pay their lost income. They can't receive anything else. I've had a client who had a nerve damage to her vagina. Birth was fine, pregnancy was fine. She's now living with long-term consequences of a birth, just regular birth. And there's no money involved. They can pay for her physio, but that's it. I think also when I did a lot of research around why people were anti-surrogacy, I came across a lot of articles that were anti-sex work. And you can read these articles, pro or anti-sex work, and just take out the word sex worker and replace it with surrogate or surrogacy. And it's exactly the same arguments. We pay sex workers because sex work is work. And I think there's a real argument there that pregnancy and birth is work, and that surrogates should be compensated. And potentially there's a bit of a radical discussion happening around whether pregnant people should be paid because they are producing the future workforce, but they also take significant risks with their lives and livelihoods. In terms of it being work, some of the thinking I've had around this is that if we were wanting to balance the rights of the child and making sure we're not commodifying or buying and selling children, is that we could be compensating surrogates and have it capped and well regulated, and making sure it's not, baby to the highest bidder situations. And also some of the screening that happens, particularly in the US and Canada, is around medical and psych screening and background checks for surrogates and intended parents, to make sure that we're not actually just recruiting people that need some money because they're on the poverty line, but they have the wherewithal and well-being and resources, emotional resources, to do surrogacy, and that they then receive payments as if it was a job rather than a cash prize at the end because they handed over a baby. They do that a lot in the US, although they use a few word gymnastics to call it. They call it compensation rather than a selling. The surrogates don't get paid for handing over the baby, they get paid for the work. And we can call it commercial. Maybe their version is a bit different to how ours would be because they don't really cap their compensation, but I think that's a conversation we need to have.
Alice, anything you want to add to that?
I completely agree. A lot of it does seem to come from wanting to control bodies, and we are totally okay with people selling their bodies to get really hurt in warehouse jobs. But as soon as it involves a vagina in some way, everyone suddenly can't handle it anymore. I did have something else I wanted to add. Completely forgot it. We'll see if it comes back later.
I do think about people that go off and do working in the mines, working on oil rigs, places where it's high risk, and they are paid for it, they're compensated for it. But surrogacy, no, not allowed to do that because we don't want you to commodify your body. Actually, I don't understand if it's different.
No, I completely agree. The other thing I did want to add was one of the reasons why I changed my mind around the time of the baby gammy case is because I think if we properly regulate it in Australia, as Sarah was suggesting, that will take out a lot of the ethical concerns that people have and generally make it better than our current, let's find people on Facebook and hope that they don't murder us when we meet situation. Because I'm a member of a sperm donation Facebook group, and hoo boy, some things in there get pretty dicey. So possibly regulation means it'll be safer for everyone in every way.
I'd have to agree on that, and I have really thought about, because I often get asked by journalists, don't you just think we should bring commercial surrogacy in? It does need to be regulated, so it's not a simple yes or no. But I think we're also concerned about situations overseas in Ukraine or Thailand where people are bringing babies back that are not well cared for in the country where they were born. The surrogate was not well cared for. I hear some horror stories about the surrogate situation, but also what happens with the baby. If we could promote surrogacy within Australia, we can guarantee much better healthcare, much better legal frameworks and support for all of the parties and the child. And we also know then we've got better records for donor conceived and surrogacy born people, that they can track their records. Here in Australia, we know that I think Argentina, for example, has absolutely anonymous egg donation. They're not allowed to even find out whether or not she has brown hair and blue eyes, for example. They will find out. We all know that they'll find out at some point. They'll go off and do an ancestry.com testing kit. But my clients are always a bit surprised that anonymous means it's not anonymous. And if we brought it into Australia, we could actually make sure that's all on the table. And compensating surrogates might be a good option to make that happen.
As part of that, I do think we need more regulation of the broader IVF industry, because some of the letters that I've gotten after some articles that I've written over the last few years are just horrifying. And we do definitely need to have a better regulatory eye over the space, because most people mean well and are doing well, but there are definitely some bad actors in that industry and also some definite price gouging going on. But that's a whole other topic.
I love it. Also, that was just like a really nice summary of my PhD thesis, that argument there of increasing access to surrogacy in Australia in light of the concerns of international surrogacy. So thanks, Sarah. And thank you both. I've got so many more questions, but I do now want to open up to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, please either raise your hand or little hand symbol up thing. I'll just on gallery view so I can view everyone. Yes, Ashan.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting. And I have one question about this last point about doing payment to birth mothers. And do you think, according to your experience, Sarah and Alice, that this would affect the emotional relationship between the child and the birth mother, as you mentioned, and then the best interest of the child what's the implication of the best interest of the child and that relation for this policy? Because I came from a country, Iran, that, you know, women are paid. It's not an official payments, but it's a usual practice that payments are doing, and we have a kind of different experience there, considering the different contextual issues, different legal and protections and other things. But I can tell you that such things doesn't go just soft and everything's okay. When money comes in, there are other problems. But now my question is exactly about the impact on that relationship. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I actually have spoken at several conferences with surrogate kids whose surrogates were paid. They were born in the US, and their relationships with their surrogates sound really great. Like they, once or twice a year, they'll go visit their surrogates and go to Disneyland. They seem to have a really good relationship, and they understand that their surrogate could have died to have them and that she got paid as well as everyone else did. It doesn't seem to... I'm sure that for some people, they would see it as I am performing a service and now I don't want to be a part of it. And for some people, it's, I have given birth to these wonderful people, but now I can pay all my medical bills and also have a bit of savings and everything's great. I think it depends on the person. Money doesn't change emotions necessarily, from my perspective.
Sorry, just kind of short sentence, that such regulations might have impact on the kind of people that want to come and do this. Do you consider this another
I think that there are, before you do IVF in Australia, if there is a donor or a surrogate involved, there is a mandatory 3 counselling sessions during which the psychologist will see whether or not this situation is for you and how you're going and how the surrogate or the donor's family is and all of that. I think we actually have enough things to weed out people who are just there for the cash, but I also think that there are some family arrangements that would not really want the surrogate to be all that involved, and that would be fine. And that if she just took the money and ran, then that would be fine. Like with most of the sperm donation arrangements at clinics in Australia, you just write a letter to the guy when the kid turns 18, and that's really all of your contact. I don't think it would really change if he had received money for that. Surrogacy isn't really that different to sperm or egg donation. Obviously, for the surrogate it is, but in terms of how the child thinks of it, really it's all about the same, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I think there was a point where I worried that the little one I gave birth to would think less of me if she thought I did it for the money. But I think, as Alice pointed out, there's so many checks and balances to do surrogacy in Australia. I think totally we did about 13 hours of counselling between us before we entered the arrangement. And I think, again, we can talk about like capping the payment amounts to keep it well regulated. I also think that we wouldn't compromise on a surrogate's bodily autonomy just because there's payment. We need to be really careful to make sure that she still feels like she can make the final decision about a pregnancy termination, for example. I know that in the US and probably everywhere else, you can write into a contract that she's not going to eat certain foods and not going to do certain things, and she's getting paid to oblige to that contract. She needs to meet the contractual obligations. I would suggest that in Australia, we still make that part of it to be unenforceable, that, you know, they can have all sorts of agreements, but ultimately she can still make the decision and still has autonomy. And also that the best interest of the child still remains the paramount consideration, regardless of any money changing hands. I think that, look, I don't know that our relationship would have changed if I'd received money. I know that because of all those checks and balances, I see situations. I saw one yesterday where partway through the counselling, the surrogate said, I can't do this. I just don't think I have the resources, the emotional resources to go through with it. And I don't think any sort of money would have made that different for her. Again, we can do lots of screening. In Victoria, we used to do police checks, for example. There's, unfortunately, I see situations, the minority, but the situations which don't go well, and I don't know that money would have made that any better or worse. In fact, it probably sometimes it might have made it better. Like Alice says, there are those arrangements that don't really want to have an ongoing relationship or a close relationship, and money would have actually allowed the surrogate to have some closure, that she didn't do it for nothing, she did it for something. And in terms of how the kids feel about it, I guess it does become part of their story, but yeah, being careful about how we word it, because I'd hate for them to see that it was in exchange for money, but I don't know any surrogates that would be doing it solely for the money anyway.
Perfect, thank you. Karen, do you want to ask your question? Her name's not Ezra Kneebone, obviously, just because I sent her my link.
Yeah, hi, Alice, and hi, Sarah. Fantastic accounts of your experiences. I'm in complete agreement that there should be payment for surrogates, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how we can, this will require a whole kind of community attitude change and policy change, and it's a lot of. But where do we start? And can we think of productive ways of trying to actually influence policy?
I might pick up on that if that's all right, and I'll hand to Alice. In my other life, I am politically active, so I can kind of be in the background of campaigns and lobbying and that sort of stuff. So there are some conversations happening. I know Rainbow Families has a bit of a gathering of people in the industry to try and lobby for legalizing or decriminalizing commercial surrogacy in those states where it's criminal. But that doesn't mean introducing commercial surrogacy in Australia. Some of the advice we got was to lobby at the ACT because they have the oldest surrogacy laws. And the ACT has said, yeah, we're going to review our surrogacy laws, but they put it as like one of the first things, we're going to review it, but only for altruistic surrogacy. So it's already on the table that it must be altruistic. However, in some of that, it's just kind of language use, in that we then talk about the prescribed expenses that a surrogate can claim, and you can try and have that conversation to say, well, do those prescribed expenses include some payment for her time and effort rather than just covering her medical expenses? And that is my view, that we could try and get it in there. As it's not, we might have to remove the altruistic aspect, but we're not going to full commercial surrogacy. We're going to talk about what is an appropriate compensation for her time and effort and the risk and everything else. One idea I had as an example was that we would pay, on top of her expenses, it would be like $1,000 a month for 10 months plus 3 months after the birth. So if she miscarried, she would still get 3 months after that. $1,000 a month works out to be less than the minimum wage per hour of the time that she's pregnant. So it's certainly not like something you would do to get $10,000 out of. It's not a cash prize. And in fact, you should probably go higher given the cost of living these days, but it would be some sort of nominal amount to say this is what you get for the months of pregnancy and then 3 months afterwards. But in terms of having the conversation, lots of conversations are happening with politicians on all sides. And it's usually lobby groups like Rainbow Families or Surrogacy Australia and those sorts of organisations. Unfortunately, it often also gets dominated by people that are involved in commercial surrogacy overseas, which isn't always helpful.
As far as changing how the broader community views commercial surrogacy, I'm surprised by how many people think we already have commercial surrogacy. We get so much American news and culture. Not very many people know somebody or know that they know somebody who was conceived using surrogacy, but they know about Kim Kardashian and Kanye West using surrogates multiple times, and they know that that was a paid thing. So I think probably as far as convincing the community goes, America's really done it for us. Yay. So that might make it a bit easier, but it's hard to bring about community change, and good luck. I think if it's
just done that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think if it's viewed, if we put it out as a thing saying that everybody else gets paid, but not the person whose life is on the line, I think that will bring across a lot of the people whose objections against it aren't just that they want to control women's bodies. And you're never going to get those people anyway.
I agree with that. I'd also say Rebel Wilson had a baby through surrogacy in America. She's Australian, and my phone ran hot for a week, and I was on every single news channel talking about surrogacy and whether or not we were going to have commercial surrogacy in Australia. And most of the people that the journalists calling me assumed that I had given legal advice to Rebel because she's Australian and she did surrogacy. I've never met Rebel. I don't know her. And if I did, I wouldn't be telling you anyway. But just really interesting how much that kind of blew up the news channel because somebody we know or think we know had a baby via surrogacy, and we need to pull that apart and check, was it her egg and why didn't she carry herself, and is she a lesbian? All of these things coming out like a headline. And if it was in Australia, like Alice said, we could actually kind of normalize that situation. I mean, you know, celebrity surrogacy isn't actually that interesting to me, but it seems to be interesting to everybody else.
Everyone loves gossip. Why not?
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions or comments in the audience? You're awkwardly for like 10 seconds to give someone time to think.
I can ask a question. My question is actually going to be directed to you, Sarah. I wanted to know how your experience of acting as a surrogate has influenced your work in the legal sector as well as your advocacy work.
Yeah, so I used to be a divorce lawyer doing mostly family law, family violence at Victoria Legal Aid, and then I was at the Aboriginal Legal Service. So very different in some respects to what I do now. When I became an egg donor, I was also thinking of setting up my own law firm and leaving those sorts of practices, and realised by attending one of the consumer surrogacy conferences that there was a lot of blokes talking about surrogacy in respect of surrogates as just being part of the deal that you kind of have to deal with, as opposed to their lived experiences. And I think the first conference I went to in 2016, there was like 6 or 7 surrogates there, and I was like, who's talking to us? Who's going to hear from us? And some of the stuff they were saying wasn't reflecting my experience of it. So I then kind of delved into doing surrogacy law and egg donation arrangements and that sort of stuff. And that's essentially what I do now. I don't do any of the divorce stuff, thank God. So it's really informed my practice in that people don't just come to me for legal advice. They sometimes come to me for kind of coaching on how does surrogacy work and how can we have a positive experience. And that's been amazing because I can give them that professional and personal experience of how, you know, I still have a relationship with my intended parents, and these are the challenges that we navigated. I really focus on the surrogate's bodily autonomy and the best interest of the child, because I know that sometimes people don't really think about those things. They're a bit shocked to find out that if their surrogate has agreed to this, she could still decide to terminate the child or terminate the pregnancy or drink alcohol during pregnancy, those sorts of things. Those discussions can be really productive because then people really appreciate what's happening. And yeah, so that's all I do these days. And I think it's been really positive. I think there's been a real shift in those Facebook groups from just kind of looking for somebody with a uterus to actually looking for somebody that you can have a long-term relationship with, and seeing the value in that, not just for yourselves, but in particular for the children born. So yeah, that's where I get the passion, I guess, for the work that I do.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last quick question. Victoria.
All right, thank you for fitting me in, and thanks for the talks. They were really interesting. It's not really my area of expertise in any sort of way, so I hope my question isn't too naive, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on allowing surrogacy or allowing people to use a surrogate for a pregnancy when there's no medical reason why or no social reason why.
A good question.
I am actually fine with it. If everyone involved is on board, I think there are a lot of reasons why some people don't want to or feel like they can't give birth, even if there aren't any physical things wrong with it. Like, wrong with them. Giving birth looks really terrifying, and there's a lot of stories about how it can just mess your body up, even if it goes well. And not everyone is up for that. And if you have someone who is and you're not, sure. If you have the emotional time and the money and everything else that goes with it, I don't personally have a problem.
This is really interesting because about half of my clients are infertile heterosexual couples and the other half are gay men. And the gay men don't have to do anything to prove that they can't carry a baby. They just turn up. And the straight couples with their long histories of infertility or their cancer treatment or anything else, they have to jump through some hoops and provide medical evidence as to why they can't carry the baby themselves. And I'm struck by, you know, the choice not to be gay, but to have a baby through surrogacy for the men, as opposed to this is our only chance to have a child from the straight couples and the single women. I think on the one hand, I think there does need to be some criteria where there's a very limited pool of women who will be a surrogate. But also I think there's autonomy on both sides for somebody to choose not to carry a baby. And I've spoken, for example, to clients who have said, well, I'm trans and to be pregnant would actually cause significant body dysphoria for me. How do we get through? And I said, well, yeah, like legally you can get through. You need to go and see a psychiatrist for several years and prove that you shouldn't carry a child. So they jump through all these hoops just because they own a uterus that it is apparently working. And I think if we just said, why can't it be enough to say, I don't want to do that, I just don't want to. And we can tick a box to say that's enough for me and I've got somebody that's willing to do it for me, that should be enough. So yeah, I guess it goes both ways. I know this discussion is also happening in America. Would you believe it? People assume that there's the sort of Hollywood surrogacy that you can just pay a surrogate, but actually agencies over there will generally preference somebody who needs it rather than who just wants it. And when you've got a limited pool of women offering to be a surrogate, who gets in line and who decides who's in the queue? It's a really interesting discussion, I think, but I don't know the answer, to be honest.
Thank you both.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much. Can we all please just give a bit of a round of applause? I just want to thank Alice and Sarah both so much for taking time out of the day to speak to us. I think